You ever have one of those days where you pay top dollar for first class and they treat you like you just climbed in from the baggage hold? Yeah, this is that story, and it starts with a woman who didn't just shake systems, she cracked them open. Caroline Levitt, sharp as a blade, bold as hell. And by 27, already a name that made corrupt execs and smug politicians sweat through. Their silk suits, an investigative journalist with a vendetta for justice and zero tolerance for bullshit. She'd built a career out of dragging systemic inequality into the daylight like roaches from a rotting wall. From exposing workplace discrimination to dragging gender bias into headlines, she'd never backed down. But nothing in her adrenaline-soaked career could have prepared her for the humiliating circus she was about to walk into, not on some foreign battlefield, but in the plush, pretense-laced cabin of a commercial flight from New York to Boston. After weeks embedded deep in Washington, D.C.'s political quicksand, Caroline was done with the smug grins and gaslit promises. It was time to fly home, back to reality, and breathe something other than hot air and half-truths. Most big-name journalists would ride out in a private jet, maybe sip overpriced champagne above the clouds, but not her. Caroline wanted no part of that elite bubble wrap. She booked herself a commercial flight, not because she couldn't afford the luxury, but because she wanted to be among the people delays, middle seats, crying babies and all. She craved authenticity, even in the inconvenience. For someone who made a living telling real stories, she lived the same way, grounded, raw, and unfiltered. Clad in a gray hoodie, black sweatpants, and a cap pulled low comfort first, screw the fashion. Police, she moved through the airport like any regular traveler. Her values ran deeper than headlines: fairness, respect, equity, not just clickbait, but a code she lived by. Whether dismantling shady corporate practices or giving the voiceless a platform, she walked the talk. But life has a sick sense of humor, and on this particular day, her own beliefs about justice were about to get dragged through the ringer. No pen, no press pass, just her boarding pass, and a one-way ticket into a storm she never saw coming. Boarding some airlines from New York to Boston, she didn't expect applause or upgrades, just a smooth flight, some peace, maybe even a nap in her first-class seat. But even before she sat down, something felt off. The moment she stepped into the cabin, she caught the look. That kind of look, the "what the hell is she doing here" stare. Caroline Reynolds, the lead flight attendant, didn't hide it well. A quick glance to her crew, Richard and Diane, and suddenly, Caroline Levitt felt less like a customer and more like a problem. As she slid into her seat, she noticed it, the side eyes, the awkward silence. She tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just tired or overworked. But then came the second boarding pass. Check. "Excuse me, miss," Reynolds said with a sugary fake smile. "Could we take another look at your boarding pass?" Her voice dripped with politeness, but Caroline could hear the subtext loud and clear. "You don't belong here, sweetheart." Confused but cooperative, Caroline handed it over again. Richard and Diane hovered, not saying much, but their glances spoke volumes. One moment, their eyes were on her boarding pass, the next on her hoodie and sweatpants like she dragged herself out of a gym locker. No direct accusations, no raised voices, just that sly, passive-aggressive "is she lost" energy oozing from every pore of the interaction. Caroline scanned the cabin. She wasn't the only one dressed down. Plenty of others lounged in jeans, sweatshirts, even a guy in sandals. But none of them were being side-eyed or summoned like suspects. Just her. "I've paid for a first-class seat," she said calmly but firmly. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" The smile she forced barely stuck. Her patience was thinning, her blood starting to simmer. "Oh no, not at all," Reynolds replied, lips curling into a corporate smile. "It's just, we have certain standards in first class. Maybe there was a mix-up." Standards. That word hit like a slap. Caroline narrowed her eyes. Standards? What exactly do you mean by that? She knew damn well what they meant, but she wanted to hear them say it out loud. Reynolds gave a vague shrug, the kind that let her dodge accountability while still twisting the knife. Caroline's jaw clenched. She'd paid full price like everyone else, and now they were acting like her presence in first class was some kind of clerical error. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was insulting. Everything she stood for, respect, dignity, equality, was being pissed on in real time. Still trying to keep her cool, she breathed deep. But the next move sent her rage into overdrive. "Would you mind showing us your ID?" Richard asked, voice now dressed in fake civility. Caroline's eyebrows shot up. ID? For what? She wasn't buying alcohol or passing through. Security. No one else was being asked for identification in their recliners. "Are you serious?" she snapped, loud enough for heads to turn. "Why am I the only one being asked this? I'm a paying customer like everyone else." Richard fumbled. Reynolds jumped back in, voice like syrup. "We just need to confirm that everything is in order." Bolsh T. This wasn't a mix-up. This was bias dressed in airline uniforms. Caroline knew the drill. She'd written about it, seen it eat people alive. Now she was being told, without being told, that she didn't look like first class, that her hoodie and cap were somehow a threat to the delicate decorum of reclining seats in pre-flight Prosecco. And just when she thought the embarrassment had peaked, they hit her with the final insult. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy?" Reynolds suggested with the grace of a slap. Caroline froze. Her face burned with fury. Her voice trembled but didn't crack. "Excuse me," she said, each syllable sharp enough to cut. "You want me to move? To economy? I paid for this." "Seat. You don't get to decide where I belong." But apparently they thought they did. They weren't just questioning her boarding pass, they were questioning her worth. In this moment, it didn't matter how many exposés she'd written, how many systems she'd dismantled, how many lives she'd changed with her words. She was just another hoodie in a sea of blazers. And that was enough to make her invisible, or worse, unacceptable. Caroline wasn't just humiliated. She was living inside the very nightmare she'd spent years putting into headlines. A breathing, walking example of the same bias-filled garbage she'd exposed in article after article. And now, instead of flying first class, she was being marched down the aisle like a criminal stripped of dignity under fluorescent lights, while the elite crowd in first class sat frozen with their expressions twisted in that classic mix of confusion, discomfort, and cowardly silence. A few passengers looked like they got it, like they knew what was happening wasn't right, but not one of them opened their damn mouth. The walk of shame down the aisle burned worse than any insult. What had started as a simple trip home had officially turned into a humiliating public performance. She didn't sit, not right away. She just stood there, planted in the economy aisle, heart racing, and fists clenched. Her mind was spinning like a busted engine. She had spoken for others, fought like hell for them, written about discrimination from every angle. But this was personal. This was her turn on the receiving end of the same bias she'd exposed in a dozen investigations. And it came from an industry she thought had grown out of that prehistoric thinking. Wrong. The sting wasn't just in the humiliation. It was in the realization that this wasn't some isolated hiccup. It was a symptom of a deeper disease, a company culture rotting from the inside, where perception was valued over people. When she finally dropped into her cramped economy seat, her face was tight with silent fury. The legroom was a joke, the injustice worse. She sat stiff, seething, eyes burning holes into the seat in front of her. Not because of a downgrade she'd taken economy flights plenty of times, but because of the why. Because she'd been judged, dismissed, demoted based on her damn hoodie and sweats. Because she triggered some internal alarm in the flight crew's heads labeled "doesn't belong here." And the more she thought about it, the more the injustice clawed at her like a fever under her skin. This was bigger than an awkward exchange. It was a full-blown case study in modern discrimination. Caroline had uncovered sleazy execs, systemic racism, shady HR departments, but never had she expected to be part of the story. Yet here she was. Another statistic. Another woman wrongly profiled and publicly embarrassed. And she wasn't about to let that go. not for one goddamn second. No, this moment was about to become one of the biggest pieces of her career, and she makes sure it landed like a bomb across the industry. When the wheels hit the Boston tarmac, Caroline was done being silent. The second her feet hit in the ground, she went straight for the throat, calling her editor before she'd even left the airport terminal. Her voice was clear, cold, cutting. The story needed to be told. Not just her mistreatment, but the way she'd been reduced to nothing because of how she looked. An experience far too common, echoed in whispers across boardrooms, airports, hotels, and now it had a face. Hers. The editor didn't even blink. They knew this was more than an op-ed. It was a headline that would gut Summit Airlines where it hurt. And just like that, Caroline's next expose was greenlit and fast-tracked. Within 24 hours, her piece was live. The headline screamed from every feed and inbox. First, class discrimination. How Summit Airlines punishes passengers for looking wrong. It wasn't just a story. It was a reckoning. Her words hit like a bat to the corporate gut, slicing through PR smoke with brutal precision, and people felt it. The article detonated online, spreading like wildfire. Passengers, journalists, influencers, even politicians started reposting it. But she wasn't the only one paying attention. Enter Alexander Bennett. Bennett wasn't your average CEO, at least not in his own head. He liked to believe he'd built Summit Airlines on integrity, on fairness, on some golden boy version of airline equality. But now, sitting in his sleek office, staring at the screen with Caroline's article lighting up like a goddamn flare, his stomach twisted into knots. There it was, raw, damning, and viral. A total body blow to the image he thought he'd built. His jaw clenched. How the hell had this slipped through the cracks? He'd spent years believing Summit Airlines was different, that his company operated above this petty, prejudiced nonsense. But Caroline's article didn't just suggest bias, it ripped the lid off and poured it into the spotlight. And now, he had no choice. This wasn't a PR disaster he could brush under the rug with an apology post. It was systemic, it was public, and it was personal. Bennett wasted no time. A board meeting was called emergency level serious. And this wasn't going to be a typical corporate tap dance. No, this was an intervention. He didn't just want to talk about the article, he wanted to confront the cancer inside the culture. And for that, he needed Caroline in the room. Not as a victim, as a goddamn reckoning. An eyewitness with a loaded pen and the guts to say what others wouldn't. The next day, Caroline walked into the Summit Airlines boardroom like a storm with purpose. The room was thick with tension, filled with a dozen polished execs who suddenly looked like students caught cheating mid-exam. Alexander introduced her with rare humility. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone unusually solemn. I believe you've all read the article. This is Caroline Levitt, journalist, passenger, and the reason we're here today, Miss Levitt, the floor is yours. She didn't play dress up for their comfort. Still in the same hoodie, sweats, and cap that had kicked off the whole damn circus, Caroline stood tall, unfazed. There was no revenge in her eyes, only brutal clarity. Thank you, she began, voice sharp as glass, calm as ice. I'm here because on Summit Airlines Flight 923, I was profiled and publicly humiliated. I paid for first class. I had a valid ticket. I followed every rule. And still, your crew decided I didn't look the part, that I didn't belong because of my clothing. Her words hit like hammers, and the silence that followed was deafening. Execs glanced nervously at each other, their power suits suddenly less intimidating under her stare. Alexander sat stiff, visibly uncomfortable, but listening. Caroline didn't slow down. I was questioned, doubted, and asked for ID for no reason other than how I looked. That is not customer service. That is discrimination, plain and simple. She paused, letting the weight settle. And I'm not the first. I won't be the last. This kind of profiling is baked into systems like yours, where appearance becomes the gatekeeper to respect, where the wrong hoodie can get you escorted to the back of the plane. And if you don't fix that, you're not just failing customers, you're actively creating a hostile culture that pushes them away. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly out of their depth. Caroline's delivery was cold, clinical, not emotional, not hysterical, just facts served with a scalpel. This isn't about one bad decision. It's about an environment that allows reward selective treatment, where bias gets disguised as protocol. That's not a small problem. That's a broken system. The air was thick with discomfort and dawning realization. Caroline had just shattered every comfortable illusion in the room, not with rage, but with ruthless truth. Alexander leaned back, the weight of what she said pressing into his chest. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about every unchecked look, every unjustified assumption, every customer treated like a threat for not fitting the mold. Summit Airlines has a judgment problem, she finished, her voice slicing through the silence, like a blade. And if you don't deal with it now, it will eat your company from the inside out. Don't tell the public you value equality, prove it. Caroline wasn't here for PR, band-aids, or polished apologies. She wanted blood. Not literally, but in the only currency that mattered in corporate boardrooms, accountability. Her message to Summit Airlines was brutal in its clarity. Change your STI or stay broken. I'm not interested in empty statements and damage control, she said, cutting through the air like a scalpel. I demand immediate action, not tomorrow, now. She laid it out without flinching. Mandatory. Anti-bias training for every staff member, a full-blown policy overhaul, and a public acknowledgement that the airline wasn't just dealing with a rogue incident, it was infected with a cultural disease that had been ignored for far too long. Alexander Bennett scanned the room, his eyes locking with each shell-shocked executive one by one. And what he saw was undeniable. They knew she was right. They saw it too, a mirror held up to their complacency. He exhaled slowly, nodding once. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. This was a defining moment for the future of Summit Airlines. I agree, he said finally, voice steady, heavy with realization. And I will ensure every single change you've demanded gets implemented. Thank you, Caroline, for forcing us to see what we chose to ignore. Her confrontation didn't just land, it cracked something open. Her words would leave a permanent mark, not just on Summit Airlines, but on the entire damn industry. Alexander wasn't just making promises. This wasn't the usual corporate dodge and smile. He stood up, looked his entire board in the face, and declared war on the toxic culture hiding under their own logo. We're done pretending this is an isolated incident, he said, his voice now sharp with resolve. This is systemic, and it ends now. His first move, a sweeping no excuses. Anti-bias training program, mandatory, non-negotiable, and built to rip unconscious prejudice out by the roots. Every single employee that interacts with passengers, every gate agent, every flight attendant, every manager will complete this training. And not just some lazy slideshow. Real education, real accountability. The room was silent. No fake nodding, no fake enthusiasm, just realization soaking in like cold water. Bias, whether it's whispered or institutional, has no place in our airline. Alexander continued, we will treat every customer, first class, economy, middle seat, aisle seat, with dignity, period. His tone left no space for negotiation. This wasn't about reputation. This was about identity. But he didn't stop at training. Next up, the feedback system. The part of the business that usually eats complaints and spits out canned replies. We're overhauling how we deal with discrimination reports, he announced. No more brushing things off as misunderstandings. No, more dumping complaints in a dead-end inbox. From now on, every report is tracked, investigated, addressed, publicly if necessary. Caroline's article had lit the fuse. Alexander wasn't going to let it burn quietly. He was throwing gasoline on it and turning the flame into reform. And then the ripple started. The internet didn't just react, it exploded. The article went viral. And suddenly, Summit Airlines wasn't the only airline sweating bullets. Other carriers started reaching out, scrambling to save face, some asking Summit, yes, the same airline that just got dragged, for advice. Caroline hadn't just triggered a story, she detonated a movement. Airline biases weren't a quiet, tolerated norm anymore. They were front page news. And Caroline, she was the name behind the reckoning. But not everything could be fixed with promises and press. The room soon turned to the three names burned into the heart of the incident: Caroline Reynolds, Richard, and Diane, the flight attendants who had turned a first-class ticket into a public humiliation. Everyone knew they screwed up. But Alexander wasn't in a firing mood, not yet. He wanted reform, not revenge. This isn't about punishing three people, he said, addressing the room and the flight attendants directly. It's about holding up a mirror and forcing change. If we fire them, the system stays the same. If we educate them, maybe something changes. Their sentence? Reassignment. No more champagne service and first-class smiles. For the next month, Caroline, Richard, and Diane would be neck-deep in the customer advocacy team, dealing directly with complaints face-to-face with the exact kind of passengers they once judged. After that, a full month working in economy class side by side with crew who grind daily to serve every passenger with equal respect. No hiding, no shortcuts. They glanced at each other. The shame was there. But so was a flicker of understanding. They weren't being thrown out, they were being shown what they failed to see. During this time, Alexander continued, they'll receive additional training focused on inclusivity, equity, and real engagement. They'll learn how assumptions destroy trust and how to rebuild it. The board sat still. Some raised brows, unsure if this was discipline or diplomacy. But others nodded. It was bold, it was unconventional, and it sent a message. This airline wasn't about to slap a band-aid on a bullet wound. It was going to stitch the damage from the inside out. If, after 2 months, their performance proves they've changed, Alexander said, they'll be eligible to reapply for their first-class roles. This isn't exile, it's a second chance, a real one. It hit different. Some of the staff were conflicted, sure, but most got it. This wasn't about making an example, it was about turning ignorance into insight. Real reform isn't clean, it's uncomfortable, gritty, and slow. But this was how it started. As the tension eased, one final voice entered the room, soft but sharp. Patricia Winters, senior board member, who'd stayed silent until now. Her tone carried the weight of guilt. I want to say this plainly, she said, eyes fixed on Caroline. What happened to you should never have happened. And the fact that it did on our watch speaks volumes about what we've failed to confront. It wasn't a speech, it was a confession. I support Alexander's decision fully, Patricia added. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong with you. It's about fixing what we've ignored across the entire system. Other members chimed in, their voices finally matching the seriousness of the moment. Some admitted the airline had tiptoed around the issue for too long. Others acknowledged the damage that could have sunk the brand entirely if Caroline hadn't stood up and burned the whole thing open. This is a turning point, one board member finally said, and not just for us. We're raising the bar. From here on out, everyone gets treated like they matter, not just the ones who look like they belong in a glossy brochure. Alexander leaned forward, nodding slowly, eyes firm with conviction. We've got one hell of a shot here, not just to fix what's broken, but to rewrite the rules, he said. This wasn't just about saving face anymore. It was about setting a precedent. Customer service, inclusivity, empathy, respect, these can't just be corporate hashtags anymore. They've got to be our baseline, the spine of everything we do. The energy in the boardroom shifted like a thunderclap. Gone was the fog of guilt and confusion. The air now buzzed with purpose. This wasn't about policy tweaks or internal memos. This was about gutting the rot and rebuilding the airline's legacy from the ground up. Caroline stepped out of that boardroom feeling wrecked, drained, but something deeper had settled in to victory. The kind that doesn't come with applause or trophies, but with a heavy sense of knowing you cracked something open that won't ever close the same way again. Her rage had burned through the bull's tea and left clarity behind. She had dragged an airline and industry into a conversation it had long avoided, and Summit Airlines was now standing at the edge of something bold and irreversible. What started as an act of disrespect had become the blueprint for transformation. And though Caroline knew change would be slow, clumsy, and sometimes messy, she also knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. 3 months later, Caroline stepped onto another Summit Airlines flight. Same airline, same face, but everything felt different. This time, she was headed from New York to San Francisco for a press conference on climate change. She boarded confidently, head high, hoodie on, 0 F.S. given about what anyone thought. And as she entered the first class cabin, she didn't hesitate, not for a second. There was no dread, no second guessing. The anxiety that once clung to her like static was gone. And then, like a twist, straight from Poetic Justice, she saw him, Richard, the same flight attendant who had stood beside her during the original debacle. But this time, the look in his eyes was different. His posture, his tone, his entire vibe had shifted. "Welcome aboard, miss Levitt," he said with calm professionalism, his voice stripped of the condescension it once carried. There was humility in his words. Respect, not forced, earned. He didn't pretend like nothing had happened. He owned it without needing to spell it out. For the first time, Caroline felt the shift wasn't just performative, it was real. She glanced around. Diane and Caroline Reynolds were on board too, working in other parts of the plane. They weren't hiding, they weren't sulking, they were doing the work. Engaging with passengers without judgment, treating everyone equally, sweatpants, suits, toddlers, tech. Bros didn't matter. The change Caroline had fought for wasn't just some corporate press release, it was in the way the crew moved, spoke, interacted. The difference was in the details. And for the first time since that humiliating flight, Caroline didn't feel like a walking test of tolerance. She felt like a passenger. Just another human being, respected, unbothered, equal. The transformation of Summit Airlines had gone far beyond slogans. It was a full-on internal revolution. The culture had shifted, visibly and fundamentally. No more side eyes at a tire. No more judging passengers by their shoes or hair or hoodie. First class or back row, everyone got the same damn respect. And the results? Obvious. Customer satisfaction had skyrocketed. Complaints had dropped. Employees felt more empowered, actually trusted to make the right calls, not biased ones. The entire tone of the company had evolved. Inclusivity wasn't a checkbox, it was now the foundation. For Caroline, this was never about revenge. She didn't want to ruin lives or launch a takedown. She wanted change. She wanted companies to face themselves in the mirror and fix the reflection. And she got that. Her story had broken the silence, lit the spark, and set in motion something far bigger than herself. It wasn't about her anymore, it was about every passenger who'd ever felt judged for how they looked, dressed, or existed. Her fight had birthed reform. Real, structural, long overdue reform. And now, Summit Airlines stood as a model not just in customer service, but in corporate accountability. Other airlines took notice. Hell, some started rewriting their own playbooks, citing Summit's turnaround as a case study. Caroline's confrontation had detonated across the entire airline industry, and it wouldn't stop there. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Caroline sat back in her first-class seat, a quiet storm of reflection in her chest. The cabin was calm, the tension she'd once been wrapped in like barbed wire was gone. In its place, calm professionalism, respect, humanity. She looked around and realized this was it. This was the moment that proved change had landed. The transformation wasn't in slogans or speeches. It was here in the lived experience, in the absence of fear and the presence of fairness, Summit Airlines had taken her outrage and turned it into a goddamn blueprint for equity. In this story, this battle wasn't just about airlines. It was about every system, every company, every institution still operating on silent prejudice and unchecked assumptions. Caroline's story hammered home one truth. Real change doesn't come from firing people or PR spin. It comes from education, from facing the ugly truth, and from refusing to look away. She didn't scream for vengeance. She demanded evolution. And she got it. The message was brutal in its simplicity. You can't fix what you won't admit is broken. Her voice became the needle that pierced corporate delusion and rewired how things were done. And as her story closed, it left a fire behind. A challenge. A mirror. A question. Where are you in all of this? Are you the silent watcher on the plane? The biased gatekeeper? The complacent executive? Or are you the one who finally says, enough? Because fairness shouldn't be a luxury. It should be the goddamn default.